Fate's Trickery. The market buzzed with life, a tapestry of colors and sounds that seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. Stalls lined the cobblestone streets, laden with ripe fruit, glinting trinkets, and the scent of spices that hung heavy in the air. Elias crouched behind a wooden cart, his dark eyes scanning the crowd. A strand of unruly black hair fell into his face, and he brushed it aside with a sharp motion, his fingers trembling. Hunger gnawed at his insides like a relentless beast, sharpening his instincts and clouding his thoughts. "Come on, Elias. Just one pouch," he muttered to himself, his voice barely a whisper. The growl in his stomach was a cruel reminder that failure wasn't an option. He spotted his mark, a portly merchant with a leather satchel that bulged at the seams. The man laughed loudly, his jowls shaking as he clapped a younger companion on the back. "Easy prey." Elias inhaled deeply, his chest tightening. As he moved through the crowd, his steps were a dance of precision. He slipped between the throngs of people, his movements fluid, his gaze unwavering. His hand darted out like a snake, grazing the satchel's clasp. In a single practice motion, he unclipped it and slipped the pouch free, tucking it into the folds of his threadbare coat. "Gotcha," he murmured under his breath, his lips curling into a faint smile. But as he turned to retreat, a child's voice froze him in place. "Hey, mister, did you drop this?" Elias's heart sank as he spun around. A girl no older than 8 stood clutching the satchel. Her wide, innocent eyes blinked up at the merchant, who was now patting himself down, his jovial demeanor replaced by confusion. Elias's mind raced. Run. That was the logical choice, but his feet stayed rooted to the spot. The merchant's gaze darted to Elias, suspicion darkening his features. "You? Stop right there." Elias bolted. The crowd erupted into chaos, vendors shouting and customers scattering. The pounding of his feet on the cobblestones matched the frantic rhythm of his heartbeat. He ducked into a narrow alley, pressing his back against the cool, damp brick wall. His breaths came in ragged gasps. "Damn it," he hissed, pulling the stolen pouch from his coat. Inside were a few gold coins and some scraps of parchment. Not nearly enough for the risk he'd just taken. "You really know how to pick your moments, don't you?" A familiar voice drawled from the shadows. Elias jumped, spinning to face the speaker. It was Mara, a wiry woman with a mischievous smirk and eyes that could cut through steel. She stepped closer, her boots crunching on the gravel. "Didn't think you'd get caught so easily," she said, folding her arms across her chest. "Losing your touch?" "Mind your business," Elias snapped, shoving the pouch back into his coat. Mara raised an eyebrow. "Oh, it's my business, all right. You're making it harder for the rest of us with your sloppy work. If you can't handle it, maybe it's time you found a new trade." Elias glared at her, his jaw tightening. "I don't have a choice." Her smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of understanding. "Yeah, well, none of us do." The weight of her words settled between them, heavy and unspoken. Elias's gaze dropped to the ground. He hated this life, hated what it had turned him into. But hunger didn't care about morals, and desperation didn't leave room for pride. Later that night, Elias sat alone on the edge of the riverbank, the stolen coins spread out in front of him. The water reflected the crescent moon, its light casting a silver sheen over the city. His stomach was full for the first time in days. He'd used part of the money to buy a stale loaf of bread and a hunk of cheese. Yet satisfaction eluded him. "You're thinking too loud," a voice said behind him. Elias stiffened, his hand instinctively moving to the knife hidden in his boot. He relaxed when he saw it was Mara again, her silhouette framed by the moonlight. She plopped down beside him uninvited, plucking a blade of grass and twirling it between her fingers. "You always brood like this after a job?" she asked, her tone light but her eyes watchful. "What do you want, Mara?" he replied wearily. "Maybe I'm curious. You've got that look, you know? Like you're waiting for something that'll never come." Elias snorted. And what would you know about it? She shrugged. More than you think. Silence stretched between them, broken only by the soft lapping of the river. Finally, Elias spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't choose this. I'm not like you. Mara chuckled, but there was no humor in it. And what am I, exactly? Cold. Ruthless. You don't care about anyone or anything. Her expression hardened, and for a moment, Elias thought she might lash out. Instead, she sighed, tossing the blade of grass into the water. You think I started out this way? She asked, her voice tinged with bitterness. You think I wanted this life any more than you did? The difference is, I stopped pretending there's a way out. Elias looked away, her words cutting deeper than he cared to admit. Trust me, Mara continued, her voice softer now. The sooner you accept that this is who you are, the easier it'll be. He didn't respond. He couldn't, because deep down he knew she was wrong. Or maybe he just hoped she was. His reluctance to trust, his refusal to connect with anyone, it wasn't just about survival. It was about holding on to the fragile belief that he could still be something more. As Mara stood to leave, she glanced down at him one last time. Don't let it eat you alive, Elias. Whatever it is you're holding on to, it's not worth it. Her footsteps faded into the night, leaving Elias alone with his thoughts and the coins that felt heavier than they should. He stared at the river, its surface rippling in the moonlight. Somewhere in the distance, a bell chimed, marking the hour. Elias closed his eyes, the weight of his choices pressing down on him. For now he was just a thief. But the war inside him raged on, and he couldn't shake the feeling that his story was far from over. Elias's pulse hammered in his ears as he pressed himself against the damp wall of a shadowy alley. His breath came fast, misting in the cool night air, and his grip tightened on the small satchel he'd just lifted from an unsuspecting merchant. For once, he'd felt good about the job, certain he'd pulled it off cleanly until now. You're fast, a voice called from the darkness, smooth and low, with a hint of gravel. Elias froze, his heart leaping into his throat. The voice came from deeper in the alley, calm yet commanding. Slowly, Elias turned, his hand drifting toward the knife tucked into his boot. He couldn't see the man, but he could feel his presence like a weight in the air. Who's there? Elias demanded, his voice sharper than he felt. A figure stepped into the faint light of a nearby street lamp. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and cloaked in a heavy coat that swayed as he moved. His face, illuminated just enough to reveal a network of scars across his cheek and jaw, was a roadmap of battles fought and survived. His eyes, sharp and unreadable, fixed on Elias with an unnerving intensity. Relax, the man said, raising a hand as if to placate him. If I wanted you dead, you'd already be bleeding. Comforting, Elias shot back, though his grip on the knife tightened. The man chuckled, the sound dry and humorless. You've got spirit. That's good. You'll need it. Elias frowned, his eyes narrowing. What do you want? I watched you back at the market, the man said, ignoring the question. Slick hands. Quick feet. But you got careless. He gestured toward the satchel in Elias's hand. Thought you'd be smarter than to linger in one place. Elias cursed inwardly. He had lingered and he knew it. But what unsettled him more was this man, this stranger, who seemed to have been watching him so closely. Look, Elias said, his tone hardening. If you're here to take the pouch, forget it. I work for this. The man smirked, the expression pulling at his scars. If I wanted the pouch, I'd already have it. What I want is different. Elias didn't like the sound of that. He took a step back, his free hand brushing against the alley wall for balance. Different how? The man took a slow, deliberate step forward. You're skilled, but you lack discipline. You're hungry, but you lack direction. And most importantly, you're alone. I don't need anyone, Elias snapped. Don't you? The man tilted his head, his expression unreadable. You're living hand to mouth, picking scraps from people who wouldn't miss them if they disappeared. That's no life. Elias felt a flare of anger rise in his chest. "What would you know about my life?" The man's gaze darkened, and for a moment, Elias thought he saw something flicker in those cold, calculating eyes. Something dangerous. "More than you think," he said quietly. "But I'm not here to trade sob stories. I'm here to offer you a deal." Elias laughed bitterly. "A deal? With you? No thanks. You haven't even heard it yet." The man's voice carried a weight that made Elias pause despite himself. "I could have turned you over to the merchant. Or worse. But I didn't. Ask yourself why." "Why?" Elias said warily, his mind racing through the possibilities. "None of them were good. Because I see potential," the man said simply. "Raw, untamed, but potential all the same. And I can help you shape it." Elias barked another laugh, though there was little humor in it. "And what do you get out of this? What's in it for you?" The man smiled faintly, but the gesture didn't reach his eyes. "Consider me an investor. If you succeed, I succeed. Right?" Elias said, the sarcasm dripping from his words. "And what happens if I fail?" "You don't want to know," the man replied, his tone making it clear he meant every word. A heavy silence fell between them. Elias's mind churned with questions. He didn't trust this man, Victor, as he'd soon introduced himself. But the way he spoke, the way he moved, the sheer presence he carried. It was like he was always 10 steps ahead, as though he'd orchestrated this entire encounter. Victor took another step closer, his voice lowering. "I'll give you time to think it over. But know this, the path you're on leads nowhere. Keep playing the lone wolf, and you'll end up dead in a ditch or rotting in a cell. My way offers you a chance to be more." Elias tightened his jaw. "Why me?" Victor paused, his gaze boring into Elias like he was trying to unravel him piece by piece. "Because you remind me of someone I used to know. Someone who made the wrong choice." Elias swallowed hard, unsure how to respond. The man's words lingered, heavy with meaning he didn't fully understand. Victor reached into his coat and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. He held it out, his movements deliberate. "This is where you'll find me if you decide you're ready." Elias hesitated, then snatched the paper from Victor's hand, his fingers brushing against the coarse fabric of the man's gloves. "Why do I feel like you already know what I'm going to do?" Elias muttered. Victor smiled again, his scarred face catching the faint light. "Because I do." With that, Victor turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing against the brick walls until they faded into the night. Elias stood there, clutching the paper, his thoughts a storm of doubt and curiosity. For the first time in a long while, he felt something beyond hunger or desperation. He felt the pull of possibility and the weight of a decision he wasn't sure he was ready to make. The moon hung low over Paris, its pale light reflecting off the cobblestone streets and casting jagged shadows across the narrow alleys. Elias adjusted the brim of his cap as he crouched behind a stack of crates, his eyes fixed on the tailor's shop across the square. The small, well-kept storefront, with its polished glass window and neat lettering, seemed out of place in this rough part of the city, a beacon of wealth in a sea of struggle. Beside him, Victor leaned casually against the wall, his scarred face half hidden in the dim light. His composure was maddening, but Elias had grown used to it over the past few days. Victor never seemed ruffled, never betrayed a hint of doubt, as if every move he made was part of a master plan. "All right," Victor said, his voice low and calm. "Go over it again." Elias sighed, shifting his weight. "I sneak in through the back alley, where Claire's already dealt with the lock. Once I'm inside, I grab the ledger from the office. It's in the desk, second drawer according to your source." Meanwhile, Claire and Marcus create a diversion out front, something loud enough to keep the shopkeeper busy. Victor nodded. "And the timing? 5 minutes, tops. Any longer, and we risk the guard patrols." Elias glanced at him, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "I've got it, all right?" Victor's lips curved into a faint smile. "We'll see." Elias bristled, but said nothing. This whole operation was Victor's brainchild. And despite Elias's initial skepticism, he had to admit the man's attention to detail was impressive. The plan was intricate, almost elegant in its simplicity. But one thing still nagged at Elias. "Why the ledger?" he asked. "If this is about money, why not just grab the cash from the register and be done with it?" Victor's eyes flicked toward the shop, his expression unreadable. "The ledger holds information, debts, transactions, connections. Information is power, Elias. And power is worth far more than coins." Elias frowned, but didn't press further. Victor had a knack for giving just enough of an answer to shut you up while leaving you with more questions. A faint whistle echoed from the alley behind them. Elias turned to see Claire emerging from the shadows, her blonde hair tucked under a dark scarf. She moved with a dancer's grace, her footsteps barely audible even on the uneven stones. "Lock's taken care of," she murmured, glancing between Victor and Elias. "Marcus is in position." Victor gave a curt nod. "Good. Let's move." Elias followed Claire through the narrow alley, the cold night air biting at his skin. At the back of the shop, the door stood slightly ajar, just as she'd promised. He felt a pang of unease. Everything was going too smoothly, and in his experience, that was never a good sign. "You've got 5 minutes," Claire whispered, her blue eyes sharp. "Don't screw this up." "Thanks for the vote of confidence," Elias muttered, slipping inside. The shop's interior was silent, the faint smell of fabric and leather hanging in the air. He moved quickly, his steps light on the wooden floorboards. The office was just as Victor had described, small, tidy, and dominated by a large oak desk. Elias pulled open the second drawer and found the ledger nestled among a stack of papers. He grabbed it and tucked it under his arm, his heart pounding. So far, so good. A sudden crash from the front of the shop shattered the silence. He flinched, but forced himself to stay focused. That would be Marcus and Claire, doing their part to keep the shopkeeper distracted. He had to move. He turned back toward the door and froze. A faint creak sounded from the floor above, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. "Damn it," he hissed under his breath. He ducked into the shadows, pressing himself against the wall. The footsteps grew louder, descending the staircase with deliberate precision. A moment later, a figure emerged, a tall man in a night robe, his hand clutching a lantern. Elias held his breath, his fingers tightening around the hilt of his knife. He didn't want to use it, but if it came down to it... The man paused, his lantern sweeping the room. "Who's there?" he called, his voice wary. Elias's mind raced. He could hear Victor's voice in his head, calm and measured. "Think, Elias. Always think before you act." Just as the man took another step, a loud commotion erupted outside, the sound of shattering glass and raised voices. The man cursed and hurried toward the front of the shop, the light from his lantern disappearing with him. Elias didn't waste a second. He slipped out the back door, his breath coming fast as he ducked into the alley. Claire was waiting for him, her expression tense. "Got it?" she asked. Elias nodded, holding up the ledger. "Let's go." They moved quickly, weaving through the maze of alleys, until they reached the rendezvous point. Marcus was already there, his broad frame leaning against a wall as he caught his breath. "That was a close one," he said, his voice tinged with excitement. "I think I scared the poor bastard half to death." "Good," Victor said, stepping out of the shadows. He took the ledger from Elias and flipped it open, his eyes scanning the pages. "And you? Any problems?" Elias hesitated. "There was someone upstairs. Almost got caught." Victor glanced up, his expression unreadable. "But you didn't." "No," Elias said, his tone sharper than he intended. "I didn't." Victor closed the ledger with a snap. "Then it's a success." Elias felt a surge of irritation. "A success? We barely made it out of there. What if?" "What ifs don't matter," Victor cut in, his voice cold. "What matters is that we got what we came for." Elias glared at him, but Victor didn't flinch. After a moment, Elias looked away, muttering under his breath. Victor's lips curved into that faint, infuriating smile. "Good work, all of you. This is just the beginning." Elias didn't know whether to feel proud or wary. He'd pulled off the job, sure, but at what cost? And as he watched Victor disappear into the night with the ledger in hand, he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just become a pawn in a game he didn't fully understand. The cool night air hummed with tension as Claire stood just outside the tailor's shop, her heart pounding against her ribs. She glanced at her reflection in the polished glass of a nearby storefront, a young woman with sharp blue eyes and a face that could shift from innocent charm to steel resolve in an instant. Tonight, she'd need both. "Are you ready for this?" Marcus's deep voice broke through her thoughts. He loomed beside her, a hulking figure dressed in a shabby coat that made him look like any other dockworker. His presence was reassuring in its own way. If things went south, Marcus was the kind of man you wanted nearby. "Of course I'm ready," Claire shot back, her tone clipped. "I don't need a babysitter." Marcus chuckled, the sound low and rumbling. "Just making sure." Victor's plans tend to get complicated. Claire didn't reply. She didn't need to. Victor had handpicked her for this role, and she wasn't about to let him, or herself, down. The distraction was her domain, and she had no intention of failing. She adjusted the scarf draped around her neck, the silk fabric feeling smooth against her fingers. It was her only luxury, a gift from life she barely remembered before the streets became her home. "Let's get started," she murmured. With a deep breath, she strode toward the shop, her heels clicking softly on the cobblestones. The light from the windows spilled onto the street, warm and inviting, a stark contrast to the cold darkness surrounding her. Inside, the tailor was hunched over a counter, his spectacles perched on the edge of his nose as he examined a piece of fine embroidery. Claire pushed the door open, the little bell above it chiming softly. The tailor looked up, his face lined with years of meticulous work, and smiled. "Good evening, mademoiselle," he greeted, his tone polite but wary. Customers, at this hour, were rare. "Good evening," Claire replied, her voice smooth and lilting. She stepped inside, letting the door close behind her, and offered a shy smile. "I hope I'm not intruding. I was told you're the best tailor in Paris, and I'm in need of your expertise." The man's posture straightened at the compliment. "You flatter me, mademoiselle. What can I do for you?" Claire hesitated, letting a flicker of nervousness cross her face. It was deliberate, of course, but the tailor didn't need to know that. "It's a bit embarrassing," she admitted, lowering her gaze. "I have a formal event tomorrow, and my dress, it's not quite right." The tailor's eyes softened. "Say no more. Let me see what I can do. Do you have the garment with you?" "Oh, no," Claire said quickly, shaking her head. "It's at home, but I thought perhaps you could help me decide on some adjustments." "I brought sketches." She produced a folded piece of paper from her pocket, opening it to reveal a crude drawing of a gown. The tailor leaned closer, his attention fully captured. "Ah, I see," he murmured, studying the sketch with the intensity of a craftsman considering a challenge. "The neckline is too sharp, yes? And the waist, perhaps a softer silhouette would flatter you more." Claire leaned over the counter, letting her scarf slip just enough to reveal the faintest glint of a necklace beneath it. She watched as the tailor's gaze flicked momentarily to the gold chain before returning to the sketch. It was a subtle move but effective. A distraction was about more than noise or commotion. It was about controlling the room, directing attention where you wanted it to go. "You're absolutely right," Claire said, her voice tinged with admiration. "You really are as talented as they say." The tailor flushed slightly, clearly pleased. "You flatter me again, mademoiselle. But talent must always meet hard work." Claire nodded, her expression earnest. "That's exactly why I came to you. I couldn't trust anyone else with this." Behind the counter, the man was utterly engrossed. He didn't notice the faint creak of the floorboards in the back of the shop or the shadow that flickered briefly in the hallway. Claire kept the conversation flowing, her words weaving a web of polite inquiries and genuine-seeming admiration. She asked about fabric types, stitching techniques, even the history of the shop. The tailor, caught up in the unexpected flattery, answered each question with enthusiasm, his earlier wariness melting away. Outside, Marcus stood near the window, keeping an eye on the street. From time to time, he glanced toward the shop, his expression unreadable. Claire didn't need to see him to know he was there. It was part of the plan, her work inside, his vigilance outside. If anything went wrong, Marcus would handle it. As the tailor began pulling out fabric swatches to illustrate a point, Claire allowed herself a brief glance at the clock on the wall. 3 minutes. Elias should be nearly done by now. I must say, the tailor said, holding up a piece of deep blue satin, this would suit you perfectly. It complements your complexion. Claire smiled, though inwardly she felt the seconds ticking by like a heartbeat. It's beautiful, she said, her voice soft. You have such an eye for detail. Before the tailor could reply, a crash echoed from the alley behind the shop. The sound was muffled but unmistakable. Claire's pulse quickened. What was that? The tailor asked, his head snapping toward the sound. Claire froze for a moment, then quickly recovered. Oh no, she said, her voice trembling. Do you think someone's trying to break in? The tailor frowned, his brow furrowing. I know surely not, but I'd better check. He moved toward the back of the shop, his steps hurried. As soon as he disappeared, Claire allowed herself a moment of relief. She stepped toward the counter, carefully slipping a hand under the pile of fabric to retrieve the small pouch Victor had insisted she plant, a decoy, part of the plan to mislead anyone who might investigate later. By the time the tailor returned, muttering about stray cats knocking over crates, Claire was the picture of innocence, her hands folded in front of her. False alarm? She asked, her tone concerned. Yes, the tailor replied, shaking his head. Nothing to worry about. Claire exhaled softly. Thank goodness. The bell above the door chimed again, and Claire turned, her expression brightening. That must be my driver, she said quickly. I'm afraid I have to go, but I'll return tomorrow to discuss the details. The tailor nodded, his face warm. Of course, mademoiselle. Any time. Claire stepped out into the night, her heart still racing. Marcus fell into step beside her as they walked away from the shop. Nice work, he muttered. She didn't reply, but a small smile tugged at her lips. She'd played her part, and played it well. Whatever Victor's ultimate goal was, Claire knew she'd just proven herself indispensable. The candlelight in the safe house flickered, casting elongated shadows on the cracked walls. Elias sat at the corner table, his fingers toying absently with the edge of a worn deck of cards. Julian paced back and forth, his boots tapping against the wooden floor. The tension between them was palpable, like a storm brewing on the horizon. This doesn't add up, Julian muttered, breaking the silence. It's too clean, too easy. Victor's never been this generous. Elias raised an eyebrow, his lips quirking in a bitter half-smile. Generous? You call slicing the take 5 ways generous? The man wouldn't give a beggar a crust of bread unless there was something in it for him. Julian stopped pacing and looked at Elias, his eyes narrowing. That's exactly my point. He's up to something, I can feel it. Elias leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. Victor's always up to something. The question is what? Julian's jaw tightened, his frustration evident. He pulled a crumpled piece of paper from his pocket and slammed it onto the table in front of Elias. This, he said sharply. I found it tucked into one of Victor's ledgers. Elias straightened, his interest piqued. He smoothed out the paper and scanned its contents. It was a list, names, dates, and sums of money. At first glance, it looked like nothing more than bookkeeping, but something about the way the numbers didn't quite align set off alarm bells. Where'd you find this? Elias asked, his tone low. "In the study, hidden under a false bottom in the drawer," Julian replied. "I knew he was hiding something. Look at the last two names, yours and mine. The sums are half of what he promised us." Elias's eyes darkened, and he clenched his jaw. "So, the bastard skimming off the top." Julian shook his head. "It's worse than that. Look at the bottom." Elias's gaze shifted to the final entry. It was a single line, scrawled hastily. "Delivery to Du Bois, midnight, Warehouse 13. His stomach churned as realization dawned. "Du Bois," he said, the name tasting bitter on his tongue. "Victor's planning to sell us out." Julian nodded grimly. "And pocket the whole take." For a moment, the two men sat in heavy silence, the weight of the betrayal sinking in. Elias felt a cold fury bubbling under the surface. He had trusted Victor, or at least as much as one could trust a man like him. Now it seemed even that was too much. "We need to act," Julian said finally, his voice firm. "If we wait until midnight, we'll be walking straight into a trap." Elias leaned forward, his mind racing. "We can't confront him directly. He's got Marcus, and that brute would snap us in half before we got a word out. We need to be smart about this." Julian nodded. "What are you thinking?" Elias's gaze flicked to the window, where the moon hung low in the night sky. "Victor doesn't know we're onto him. That's our advantage. We let him think his plan's working. Let him lead us to this Du Bois. Then we make our move." Julian frowned. "And if he catches on?" Elias smirked, though there was little humor in it. "Then we make sure he regrets underestimating us." Later that night, Elias and Julian shadowed Victor from a distance as he made his way through the dimly lit streets of Paris. The city was quieter at this hour, the usual bustle replaced by the occasional bark of a stray dog or the soft murmur of a drunken song. Victor walked with purpose, his steps confident, as if he had already counted the money he intended to steal. "Stay close," Elias whispered to Julian as they ducked into an alley. "We can't lose him." Julian nodded, his eyes scanning their surroundings. "Do you think Claire's in on it?" he asked quietly. Elias hesitated. Claire had played her part in the heist perfectly, her quick thinking and charm ensuring their success. But could she have been playing a deeper game all along? The thought unsettled him. "I don't know," he admitted. "But until we do, we can't trust anyone." Victor turned a corner, heading toward the docks. Elias and Julian quickened their pace, keeping to the shadows. The air grew colder as they neared the waterfront, the sound of lapping waves mixing with the creak of wooden ships. There it was, Warehouse 13, its large doors slightly ajar, spilling slivers of light onto the cobblestones. Victor slipped inside without hesitation. "Now what?" Julian asked, his breath visible in the chilly air. Elias's mind worked quickly. "We wait for Du Bois to show. Then we make sure they don't leave with what's ours." Julian grinned, a glint of mischief in his eyes. "I like the way you think." Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as they crouched in the shadows. Finally, the sound of heavy footsteps broke the silence. A group of men approached the warehouse, their leader unmistakable, a tall, broad-shouldered figure with a scar running down his cheek. "Du Bois," Julian whispered. They watched as Victor greeted the man with a handshake and a smug smile. The two exchanged words, their voices too low to make out, but the body language was clear. Victor handed over a small chest, their cut of the heist, no doubt. "That's it," Elias hissed. "We can't let them leave with that." He and Julian moved swiftly, slipping into the warehouse through a side door. The inside was dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of salt and dust. Victor and Du Bois stood near the center, their men flanking them. Elias signaled Julian, and the two split up, creeping closer. He felt his pulse quicken as he neared Victor, his knife glinting faintly in the light. "Victor," Elias called out, stepping into view. His voice echoed through the space, freezing everyone in place. "Going somewhere?" Victor turned, his expression shifting from shock to anger. Elias, he said smoothly, though his eyes betrayed him. What are you doing here? I could ask you the same thing, Elias replied, his tone icy. But I think I already know. Du Bois frowned, glancing between the two men. What is this? This, Elias said, gesturing to Victor, is a man who thought he could double-cross us. But he forgot one thing. Victor's lips curled into a sneer. And what's that? Elias stepped closer, his knife glinting. Never cheat a thief. The dim glow of the morning sun seeped into the narrow alley where Elias sat, his back pressed against a cold brick wall. The night's chaos still buzzed in his mind. Victor's betrayal, the scuffle at the warehouse, and the chest of stolen goods slipping through his fingers. Julian had gone to lie low, leaving Elias to figure out their next move. And Elias had a plan, one as risky as it was clever. He rose to his feet, brushing the dust from his worn coat, and made his way to the tailor's shop. The streets were already stirring with life, vendors shouting their wares and carriages clattering over cobblestones. As Elias approached the shop, he adjusted his demeanor, no longer a thief, but a man with a grievance. The bell above the tailor's door jingled as he stepped inside. The smell of fabric and dye mingled with the faint tang of dust. Behind the counter stood the tailor, a stout man with wire-rimmed glasses perched on his nose. His sharp eyes narrowed at Elias, immediately wary. "You again," the tailor said, his voice curt. "If you're here to cause trouble—" Elias raised his hands in mock surrender. "Not at all, monsieur. In fact, I've come to help." "Help?" The tailor scoffed. "The only help I need is for thieves like you to stay far away." "Ah, but that's the thing," Elias replied smoothly. "You've been wronged, and I'm here to set it right." The tailor folded his arms, skepticism etched into his features. "And why would a scoundrel like you care about righting wrongs?" Elias leaned on the counter, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Because the man who wronged you has wronged me as well, and I have a way to ensure he pays." The tailor hesitated, curiosity flickering in his eyes. "Go on." Elias took a breath, choosing his words carefully. "Last night, Victor, a man you may know as one of your customers, stole a chest of goods. But not just any goods. Fine fabrics, threads, and trimmings. Things he knew you'd recognize, given their rarity." The tailor's face darkened. "Victor? He was here just days ago, boasting about a new commission. I should have known better. And now," Elias said, spreading his hands, "he plans to sell them off to line his own pockets. But here's where you come in. If we act quickly, we can recover what's yours before it's too late." The tailor frowned, suspicion creeping back into his expression. "And why do you care? What's in it for you?" Elias gave a small, rueful smile. "Let's just say Victor owes me a debt, and I intend to collect. Helping you is simply a means to an end." The tailor studied him for a moment, then nodded grudgingly. "What's your plan?" Minutes later, Elias and the tailor were striding through the streets, their steps brisk with purpose. Elias had already scouted Victor's usual haunts, and it didn't take long to deduce where the stolen goods might be stashed. They reached a crumbling tenement on the edge of the Seine, its windows grimy and its door hanging slightly ajar. Elias gestured for the tailor to wait as he slipped inside, moving with practiced stealth. The interior was dim and cluttered, the air heavy with the scent of mildew. Elias's sharp eyes scanned the room, searching for anything out of place. And there it was, a chest tucked in the corner, partially covered by a tattered blanket. The familiar lock confirmed it was the prize they sought. Elias crept back to the doorway and motioned for the tailor. "It's here," he whispered, "but we'll need to act fast. Victor's men could return any moment." The tailor nodded, his resolve evident despite the nervous twitch in his hands. Together, they heaved the chest out of its hiding place and toward the door. Just as they reached the threshold, a shadow loomed over them. Well," a deep voice drawled. Elias's stomach sank as Marcus, Victor's enforcer, stepped into view. His hulking frame blocked the exit, and his eyes glinted with amusement. "What do we have here?" "Marcus," Elias said, forcing a grin. "Fancy meeting you here." Marcus's gaze shifted to the chest, then to the tailor. "Didn't know you'd taken up charity work, Elias. What's this about?" Elias's mind raced, and he quickly concocted a story. "Victor sent me to retrieve this for him. Thought it was too risky leaving it here." Marcus's brow furrowed. "Victor didn't say anything about—" "He didn't have to," Elias interrupted smoothly. "You know how he is. Always thinking 3 steps ahead. Told me to take care of it quietly. You can confirm with him later, but if we don't move now, the authorities might catch wind." Marcus hesitated, suspicion warring with the logic of Elias's words. Finally, he grunted and stepped aside. "Fine. But if you're lying—" "I'd never dream of it," Elias said, his tone breezy. He motioned for the tailor to follow, and together they lugged the chest out into the daylight. Once they were safely away, the tailor turned to Elias, his expression a mix of relief and gratitude. "I don't know how you managed that," he said, shaking his head. "But I suppose I owe you my thanks." Elias gave a modest shrug, though his eyes sparkled with satisfaction. "It's what I do, monsieur. Now, I believe we both have what we need." The tailor hesitated, then extended his hand. "You're a rogue, Elias, but perhaps not a lost cause." Elias shook his hand, a faint smile playing on his lips. "I'll take that as a compliment." As the tailor walked away, chest in tow, Elias turned back toward the city. He hadn't just outsmarted Victor's men. He'd secured an ally in the process. For a man like Elias, that was worth its weight in gold. The streets of Paris were alive, a chaotic symphony of sights, sounds, and smells that danced in the chill morning air. Cobblestones, slick with dew, glistened like polished jewels in the faint light of dawn. A carriage rumbled by, its wheels clattering, the driver snapping his reins with a sharp alias as the horses surged forward, their hooves striking the ground in rhythmic harmony. Elias stood at the corner of Rue Saint-Denis, his gaze sweeping over the bustling market that was already springing to life. Vendors called out to passers-by, their voices a blend of urgency and charm. Fresh baguettes, still warm from the oven, herbs and spices, a dash of the Orient for your stew. The smells were intoxicating. Freshly baked bread mingled with the tang of aged cheese and the sharp, earthy aroma of herbs piled high on makeshift tables. Elias's stomach growled, and he smirked wryly. Hunger was a familiar companion, one that kept him sharp, though not always pleasant company. A commotion drew his attention to a fishmonger's stall, where a wiry man was haggling furiously with a stout woman in a faded bonnet. 6 sous for a cod? "You're robbing me blind," the woman exclaimed, her hands planted firmly on her hips. 6 sous is a bargain for fish this fresh, the vendor countered, gesturing to the silver-scaled catch glistening in the early sunlight. "You won't find better anywhere in Paris." Elias chuckled softly, shaking his head. There was something oddly comforting about the predictable bickering of the market. It was a constant, like the Seine's lazy current winding its way through the heart of the city. He turned down a narrower street, where the atmosphere shifted. The noise of the market faded, replaced by the muted murmur of distant conversations and the occasional creak of a wooden sign swinging in the breeze. The buildings here leaned toward each other like old friends, their facades weathered but proud. Wrought iron balconies, some adorned with potted geraniums, jutted out over the cobblestones below. Shadows played across the walls, the light filtering through the gaps like secrets slipping between whispered words. A cat darted across Elias's path, its sleek black form vanishing into the shadows of an alley. He paused, his eyes narrowing as he took in the narrow passage. The alley was dimly lit, the faint glow of a gas lamp casting an eerie greenish hue. It smelled of damp stone and faintly of wine, likely spilled from one of the countless bottles that found their way into the hands of the city's nocturnal wanderers. Elias's footsteps echoed softly as he moved further into the labyrinth of alleys that wound through the heart of Paris. Here, the city revealed its underbelly, a world of whispered deals and hurried footsteps, of secrets traded like currency. A beggar slumped against a wall, his tattered cap extended in silent plea. Elias slipped a coin into it without breaking stride. He knew what it was like to have nothing. Emerging onto another bustling street, he found himself near a cafe, its small tables spilling onto the sidewalk. Patrons sipped steaming cups of coffee, their conversation a low hum punctuated by laughter and the occasional clink of porcelain. "Another cup, monsieur," a waiter asked a grizzled man in a beret, his newspaper spread across the table. "Why not? Bring me one of those croissants as well," the man replied, his voice gravelly but warm. The cafe scent wafted toward Elias, strong coffee, buttery pastries, and a faint trace of pipe smoke. He allowed himself a brief moment to inhale deeply, savoring the vicarious indulgence before continuing his journey. The Seine came into view, its surface shimmering like liquid mercury under the pale sun. The riverbanks were alive with activity, artists setting up easels, their brushes poised to capture the city's beauty, lovers strolling hand in hand, their laughter carried on the breeze, and a small boy chasing after a stray balloon that bobbed just out of reach. Elias leaned against the stone railing, his eyes tracing the elegant arches of the Pont Neuf. Beyond the bridge, Notre Dame stood in quiet majesty, its twin towers rising against the pale blue sky. Bells rang out, their deep, resonant tones filling the air and washing over the city like a benediction. He pulled his coat tighter against a sudden gust of wind, his thoughts returning to the life he led in this vibrant, relentless city. Paris was a paradox, a place where beauty and brutality coexisted, where the opulence of gilded salons stood in stark contrast to the squalor of the tenements. It was a city that demanded everything from those who dared to call it home, but it gave something back in return, a fierce, unyielding spirit. A vendor approached, his cart piled high with roasted chestnuts, their smoky aroma wafting through the air. "Chestnuts, monsieur," the man offered, his smile warm despite the cold. Elias hesitated, then handed over a coin, accepting the small paper cone of steaming nuts. He popped one into his mouth, the heat and flavor spreading through him like a balm against a chill. "Merci," Elias said, his voice soft but genuine. "De rien," the vendor replied, tipping his hat. As Elias continued his journey, the chestnuts warming his hand, he couldn't help but marvel at the city that had shaped him. Paris was more than a backdrop to his story. It was a character in its own right, capricious, intoxicating, and endlessly alive. It had taught him to survive, to adapt, and above all, to keep moving. And so he did, disappearing into the maze of streets and alleys, a shadow among shadows in the city of light. The night had fallen over Paris, cloaking the city in a veil of mystery and intrigue. The cobbled streets shimmered faintly under the glow of gas lamps, their flickering light casting long shadows that seemed alive with secrets. Elias sat alone on a low stone wall overlooking the Seine, the river's gentle murmur mingling with the distant hum of the city. In his hand, he turned a silver coin over and over, its surface catching the light as it spun between his fingers. His thoughts were restless, circling around the events of the past few weeks, the heist, the betrayal, and the unexpected twists that had left him questioning everything. The coin was a token of his success, a reminder of his skill and cunning. But tonight it felt heavier than usual, as if it carried the weight of his conscience. From behind him came a soft rustling sound. Elias turned, his hand instinctively going to the knife hidden in his boot. But it was only a stray dog, thin and scruffy, sniffing at a discarded scrap of bread. He let out a breath and relaxed, watching as the animal cautiously approached the morsel, tail tucked low. "Hungry, huh?" Elias murmured. The dog's ears perked up at his voice, but it didn't flee. "I know the feeling." He tossed the coin in the air, caught it, and stared at it again. What was he doing? Was this what his life had become? An endless cycle of stealing and running, of planning and evading, of hunger and guilt. He had always told himself it was survival, nothing more. But tonight, the justification felt hollow. A voice cut through his thoughts. "Penny for your thoughts, Elias?" He whipped around, his hand on the hilt of his knife once more, but relaxed when he saw Claire standing there, her arms crossed and a curious expression on her face. She was dressed simply, her shawl wrapped tightly against the night's chill, but her sharp eyes missed nothing. "Claire," he said, his voice guarded. "What are you doing here?" "I could ask you the same," she replied, stepping closer. Her gaze fell on the coin in his hand. "Thinking about your fortune?" "Fortune?" Elias gave a humorless laugh. "If you can call it that." She perched beside him, the scent of lavender trailing in her wake. For a moment, they sat in silence, the sounds of the river filling the space between them. "You're troubled," Claire said finally. "I can see it." Elias clenched his jaw. "Trouble's part of the job, isn't it?" "I'm not talking about the job," she countered. "I'm talking about you." He didn't answer. Instead, he stared out at the water, the currents swirling and breaking against the stone embankments. "I know what you're thinking," Claire continued, her voice softer now. "You're wondering if this is all there is, if there's a way out. And what if I am?" Elias shot back, his tone sharper than he intended. "What's the point in dreaming about something I'll never have? Why do you think it's impossible?" Elias turned to her, his eyes flashing. "Because the world doesn't give men like me a way out, Claire. What am I supposed to do? Work an honest job? Who's going to hire a pickpocket with no papers and a record?" "You're more than just a pickpocket," she said firmly. "You're smart, Elias. Resourceful. You've survived things most people couldn't even imagine. That counts for something. Does it?" He laughed bitterly. "Because all it's gotten me is more trouble." Claire reached out and placed a hand on his arm, grounding him. "You're not wrong, Elias. The world isn't kind to people like us. But that doesn't mean you have to let it define you. You have a choice." "Do I?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Because right now it doesn't feel like it." Claire looked at him for a long moment before speaking again. "Do you remember the first time we met?" Elias frowned, caught off guard by the change in subject. "At the market, wasn't it?" "Yes," she said with a small smile. "You tried to pick my pocket and I caught you. But instead of running, you stayed. You talked your way out of it. Told me some ridiculous story about needing money for a sick sister." Elias chuckled despite himself. "And you believed me?" "No," she said, laughing softly. "But I saw something in you that day, a spark. Something that told me you were better than the life you'd been dealt." He shook his head, a mix of amusement and frustration flickering across his face. "You're giving me too much credit." "Maybe," she admitted. "But maybe you're not giving yourself enough." They fell silent again, the weight of her words settling over them. Elias thought about the jobs he had pulled, the people he had stolen from, the alliances he had made and broken. Each decision had been a step down the path he now found himself on. But was it the only path? Could he turn around? Or was it too late? "You really think I could change?" he asked finally, his voice tinged with both hope and doubt. "I think it's up to you," Claire said. "But if anyone can figure out how, it's you." Elias looked down at the coin in his hand, then flicked it into the river. It landed with a soft plink, vanishing into the dark water. "Maybe," he said, more to himself than to her. "Maybe." Claire smiled, her eyes filled with something like pride. "That's a start." As they rose and began walking back toward the city, the streets seemed less daunting, the shadows less oppressive. For the first time in a long time, Elias felt the faint stirrings of something he thought he had lost: hope. The room was dimly lit, the flickering glow of a single oil lamp casting dancing shadows on the cracked walls. Victor sat at the center of it all, his posture relaxed, one boot resting casually on the edge of a rickety wooden table. The faint smell of tobacco lingered in the air, curling up from the cigar he held loosely between his fingers. His scar, a jagged, pale streak that ran from his temple to his jaw, caught the light and seemed to shift with every flicker of the flame. It was the kind of scar that invited questions, but warned against asking them. Elias leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, watching the man. He had seen his fair share of rogues and villains in his time, but Victor was different. There was something about him, an air of authority wrapped in unpredictability. It wasn't just the scar or the way he moved with deliberate calm. It was the look in his eyes. They were dark and piercing, as if he could see through every lie, every facade. "You going to stand there all night?" Victor's voice cut through the silence, smooth but carrying an edge that demanded attention. Elias straightened, pushing off the doorframe. "Just wondering what your angle is." Victor smirked, taking a slow drag from his cigar before tapping the ash onto the table. "My angle?" "Yeah," Elias said, stepping further into the room. "You pull me off the street, offer me a job, no questions asked. You don't strike me as the charitable type, so what's in it for you?" Victor leaned back in his chair, his smirk deepening. "You've got a sharp tongue, kid. But you're right, I'm not in the business of charity." "So what is it, then?" Elias pressed. "What do you want from me?" Victor took his time answering, as if savoring the tension. Finally, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. The movement brought his scar into sharper focus, and Elias couldn't help but wonder what kind of story it carried. "I want competence," Victor said simply. "And you've got it. Quick hands, quicker mind. You see opportunities where others see obstacles. That's rare. Flattery doesn't suit you," Elias said dryly, though he couldn't ignore the flicker of pride in his chest. "But it still doesn't answer my question. Why me?" Victor's expression darkened, the easy smirk slipping into something more serious. "Because I've been where you are, kid. Scraping by, trusting no one, thinking the world's out to crush you. And mostly being right about that." Elias raised an eyebrow. "And what, you decided to pay it forward?" "Not exactly," Victor said, a hint of amusement returning. "Let's just say I see potential. Waste it if you want, but that's on you." There was a beat of silence, thick with unspoken thoughts. Elias studied Victor, trying to read between the lines. The man was a puzzle, every piece carefully hidden. His scar, his calm demeanor, his cryptic words, they all hinted at a past Elias couldn't begin to unravel. "What happened to you?" Elias asked, the question slipping out before he could stop it. He immediately regretted it. Men like Victor didn't take kindly to prying. But to his surprise, Victor didn't snap or shut down. Instead, he chuckled a low, almost bitter sound. "That's a loaded question." "I've got time," Elias said, emboldened by the lack of immediate anger. Victor studied him for a long moment, as if weighing whether Elias was worth the truth. Finally, he spoke, his tone quieter now. "You see this?" He gestured to the scar with the tip of his cigar. "Came from trusting the wrong person. Thought we were partners. Turned out I was just another stepping stone." Elias frowned, his curiosity piqued. "What happened?" Victor's eyes darkened further, and for a moment, Elias thought he might shut down after all. But then he leaned back, exhaling a plume of smoke. "What always happens," Victor said. "Greed. Ambition. Someone gets the bright idea they can have it all if they just get rid of the competition. Only, I didn't go quietly." The words hung heavy in the air, laced with unspoken violence. Elias didn't need the details to picture the scene: betrayal, a fight, bloodshed. "And now?" Elias asked cautiously. "You don't trust anyone?" Victor smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Trust is a liability in this line of work. But that doesn't mean you don't work with people. You just make sure you're always holding the cards." Elias nodded slowly, unsure whether to feel impressed or wary. Victor's philosophy was cold, but it made sense. In their world, trust could be a death sentence. "So why trust me?" Elias asked, his tone lighter now, almost teasing. "Or am I just another gamble?" Victor's smirk returned, this time with genuine amusement. Maybe I like living dangerously. Elias couldn't help but chuckle. Fair enough. The conversation shifted after that, moving to the logistics of their next job. But even as they talked, Elias found himself stealing glances at Victor, trying to piece together the man behind the scar. He didn't know whether Victor's story was the whole truth or just a carefully crafted part of his mystique. Either way, it was clear that Victor's past had shaped him, turning him into a man who thrived on control and calculated risks. As Elias left the room later that night, his thoughts lingered on Victor. The man was a mystery, a shadowy figure whose motivations were as elusive as smoke. But one thing was certain. There was more to Victor than he let on. And if Elias was going to work with him, he'd have to stay sharp, because with Victor, nothing was ever as simple as it seemed. The sun was just beginning to rise, painting the Parisian skyline in hues of gold and amber. Elias stood on the rooftop of an old tenement building, his silhouette stark against the waking city. Below him, the streets bustled to life, vendors shouting their wares, carriages rattling over cobblestones, and the occasional bark of a stray dog. It was a city that never truly slept, and Elias couldn't help but feel like a part of its pulse, its chaos. Victor's voice echoed in his mind. Trust is a liability, but survival is an art. It was something he had said on their last job together, just before vanishing into the night with his cut of the profits. Victor hadn't even said goodbye, leaving Elias to wonder if he would ever see the enigmatic man again, or if he even wanted to. Elias reached into his pocket and pulled out the small leather pouch Victor had handed him before disappearing. It was heavier than he expected, its contents jingling softly. He loosened the drawstring and peered inside. Gold coins. More than enough to start fresh, if he wanted to. He clenched the pouch tightly, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. The heist at the tailor shop had left him with more than just money. It had left him with questions about trust, loyalty, and what kind of man he truly wanted to be. Victor's influence lingered, like a shadow he couldn't quite shake. The man had a way of pulling people into his orbit, and Elias was no exception. Elias, a soft voice called from behind him. He turned to see Claire stepping onto the rooftop, her brown hair catching the morning light. She had a way of appearing when he least expected it, like a ghost that refused to be forgotten. "You're up early," he said, slipping the pouch back into his pocket. "So are you," she replied, crossing her arms as she joined him at the edge. Her eyes scanned the city below, but Elias could tell she wasn't just looking at the view. "What's on your mind?" He hesitated, unsure how much to share. Claire had been a part of the plan, a crucial piece of their last heist. But she had also seen through him in ways that made him uneasy. "Thinking about what's next," he said finally. "Where I go from here." She glanced at him, her expression unreadable. And I don't know," he admitted. "Maybe I find a way out of this life. Or maybe I stick around long enough to see how deep it goes." Claire smirked faintly. "You don't strike me as the kind of man who settles down and opens a bakery." Elias chuckled. "No, I suppose not." A silence fell between them, comfortable but charged with unspoken possibilities. Claire broke it first. "Whatever you decide, just make sure it's your choice," she said. "Not Victor's. Not anyone else's. Yours." Elias nodded, her words sinking in. He didn't know where the road ahead would take him, but for the first time, he felt like he had the power to choose. Whether he would use his skills for good, for survival, or for something else entirely, it was a question only time could answer. The pouch of gold weighed heavily in his pocket as he turned back to the city. Paris stretched out before him, a maze of endless possibilities. For now, the future remained uncertain, and Elias wouldn't have it any other way. If you're hooked on these audiobooks, make sure to hit like, subscribe to keep up with our latest releases, and share the magic with others. Your support means the world to us and helps us grow this amazing audiobook family.